I am so excited for this week's guest on Burnout to Brilliance. We have the amazing Rachel J jumping on. Now, I am so excited. We have done a couple of collaborations together. I've been on Rachel's podcast. So, we are going to jump into her story today. So, welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you. We have amazing chats when we get on with each other, so this will be fun as
I
well.
know we always pull the best out of each other, which I love. So,
Yeah.
so let's start with for those of anyone who doesn't know you, we'll start with our 4R because we always go through 4Rs when we do these guest podcasts, which is, and the first one is reflect. So let's reflect on who is Rachel. So again, for those who don't know you, who are you?
Who am I? And I feel like when I get asked this question, it's almost such a confronting question. Who am I? Well, I host a podcast called the Rachel J Podcast. I'm also a writer and presenter, and I'm also a master coach. And so I've been in the wellness space for over 10 years now. And so I really enjoy, sort of helping people in this space, in the wellness space. And, prior to all of that, I also was an actress. And so my previous life, I was working more in media and entertainment. So that's sort of the
Neighbors.
summary. Yes, the summary of my history.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. And so the Rachel J podcast, what are the things that you talk about on there? Because I love some of the guests that you've had on. You've had some incredible people.
Yeah, so we mainly talk about wellness, lifestyle, business, entrepreneurship. Obviously, I've had, some of my actor friends on there as well, and generally we speak about mostly the things that bring us together in terms of humans is our life lessons, also any defining sort of things that we've gone through in our lives in terms of wellness and also business that kind of shape, I guess, the trajectory that we're going in if you're a business owner, but also in terms of wellness, mental health, and all of those kinds of things. So they're the areas that I'm really interested in. So,
Mhm.
selfishly, it's a nice little conversation for me to have every week with people. But yeah, I love having those conversations.
And you can see why Rachel and I are so aligned because we literally talk about so much of the same stuff, but we bring such, interesting perspectives to the space, I think, which is why we have such a fun time when we're together. So, well, that kind of nicely leads to our big topic of conversation today, which is your story. So, in my 4R formula, the second R is always about redefining. And sometimes this is a moment or something that's happened to us. So for you, and the things that you're doing, has there been a redefining moment or shift in perspective that have really kind of changed the trajectory of things for you?
Yeah, and like we were saying before we hit record, there are so many moments I feel that I have had to become a new version of myself. But I feel like the one that's coming up to share with you is probably the moment from when I changed careers, obviously, from being an actress to moving into the wellness space. And I think for me, one of the big things that had to shift for me was letting go of the identity of being an actor. And that for me was a
Mm.
very, very big thing. I had been an actor for such a long time, and a lot of my identity had been wrapped up in that label of being an actor. And you do get a lot of significance from that career path. You are obviously a little bit more front facing in terms of your work and whatnot. But I'd spent quite a few years in LA living on and off there, and I ended up coming back to Melbourne. I actually, when I landed in Melbourne, I had an audition for Neighbours, and I that's when I booked. This is the second time I've appeared on the show, and so I went on to do that. And I feel like those moments there were not that I didn't have a great time filming the show, but that's when I started to transition into the wellness space. And I think perhaps having lived in LA and being immersed in that industry over there, it's quite different to
Mm.
being in Australia. And it's not to say that, LA was amazing, but there are certain aspects of the industry that are more outward focused, obviously. As an actor, you are selling your talent, selling who you are, and that's really your product in a sense. And so I think I had this deep kind of niggling that this wasn't going to be as fulfilling as if perhaps I were to help people. And I think, as an actor, yes, you can link it to being like, oh, well, we entertain people, and that's a
Hmm.
bit of escapism. And obviously, everyone loves to watch television and movies and that kind of thing, and I still love to this day. But then, I think there was a deeper sense in me to feel like I was doing something that was going to immediately impact people and help people, and that's where that shift started to happen, to moving into more of the wellness space. And how, for myself, really, one, on one end is looking at your own wellness, but then secondly, how can I make a more of a positive impact in people's lives beyond acting? And I felt like I could do that more in a different space. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was a bit of a redefining moment, I think.
Well, and I'm curious. I like the way that you worded it. It was very diplomatic of you. I have to say, you were like, LA's a little bit more outward focused. Or
Mm.
however you wanted to say, external focus, like compared to Australia. So I guess if I can be a bit more direct, did you find that if in my mind I'm like, was LA a bit more superficial than Australia, or did you find the working culture different? Because even outside of the acting industry, when I've had, say, people in certain corporate industries, when they go from here to the US or the UK, they're quite shocked because the culture might be a bit more rude or a bit direct, or like they feel unvalued. What was your experience from, I guess, the Australian acting culture and industry to going to the LA kind of industry?
I think when I say externally focused, because it's not to say that there aren't pockets of LA that are very actually quite spiritual. So it depends on kind of which pockets you get into. I think in terms of the industry, it's entertainment business. It's a business over there, and because Australia, I feel in comparison, is a much smaller industry. Yes, it's a business here, but unless you are a full-time working actor in Australia, which the ones that are working all the time, and you'll see them on all the Aussie shows, those opportunities aren't sort of very they're not available for every single actor. Same with LA. Obviously, opportunities for actors are not overwhelmingly a lot, but I feel like it's just a business in LA. It's very much a business over there. And so it's not to say that there was, in terms of the industry, there was that much of a difference in terms of how they operate within. But I
Mm,
think it's just more, if you're in that space or if you're in that environment, you naturally are going to be more focused on those things to propel yourself forward as an actor. And those things that do propel you forward are more about, how do I get another job? How do I be seen more? How can I? It's very eye focused. It's because you are the
mm,
product. You're the actor, and so you're working on your craft. You're working on things within you, and so in that sense, which is all fine, but I just felt that, when you work in the space that I do now in terms of wellness, you're thinking about, what do other people need?
mm,
What can I bring that is going to be of more value? What's going to give more of a positive impact to other people? I felt like perhaps as an actor, maybe that's not my best, not to say that I'm not a good actor, but it's just more, is that the best application of everything that's within me to bring to the world? Is that the best that I can give the world? And I
mm,
started to question that, and came up with the idea that maybe just being an actor isn't necessarily the best value that I can bring or the best impact that I can have. So that's,
mm.
I guess, more the idea, like the thinking about me as opposed to
Yeah.
others, in that way.
And so I know, so we just did a bit of a conversation for your podcast that'll be coming out. And something we touched on briefly is ego death, or, the path of least resistance, or choosing what feels good to you versus the identity you created and the identity that other people know you as. And I guess what I'm kind of asking is a bit of a two questions. One is, how did you know like the wellness industry from acting, but also how did you break free of that identity? Because if your friends know you as the actress, your family, and I'm sure there's going to be people who would have been like, Rachel, you put so much time and energy and money into this. Why give up, give up now? And I say that in quotations because it's not
Mm.
giving up, it's actually choosing what's right for you. But I'm sure there would have been other people giving you unsolicited advice or kind of being like, are you sure, sweetheart? Are you sure?
Yeah.
So how did you manage those things, and how did you know wellness out of all the things that you could have done?
Well, I think firstly the identity piece, the ego piece, that was a difficult transition for me. I feel like it took quite a few years actually because I had identified so much as an actor and it was so much wrapped up in who I perceived myself to be. It was a slow process of almost letting go. So that took a while
Mm,
to actually let go of the identity of being an actor. And so that was one piece in itself. Knowing wellness, I feel like that happened quite slowly. I think it was a natural interest of mine to start to get into. I've always been interested in personal development. So in a way, I can say that actually acting, the crossover between acting and wellness and personal development is that as an actor, you study human behavior. And I think the misconception is that you are pretending to be somebody else. But what actually happens when you're studying the craft of acting is you need to actually understand why humans do the things that they do and what is driving them. What beliefs does this character hold? Why is she being this way? And you've got to look at that from an objective lens. So you can't have a judge. Just
mm,
say, for example, you're playing a serial killer or something like that. You can't be playing a serial killer and then judging the serial killer because you have to embody the serial killer. You need to understand, why does she think that this is okay? What's going through
mm,
her mind? What's happened in her childhood that's made her this way, that's making her take these actions. So in a way, acting has led me into the path of understanding human behavior. And what I found to be
mm,
so interesting in studying the craft of acting is not so much the, of course, the appearing on stage and appearing on TV is all fun and stuff, but in the little actor studios where I would study the craft of acting, I found that I got to know myself really well. It was almost like a crash course in how humans operate. And so, in a way, maybe acting led me into this space. And so then I wanted to learn more. I wanted to know more about, just for my own personal, interest in knowing, how do people, hey, why do people do this? Why are people doing this? Why does that person think this way? And why does this person think this way? And so it came from just a personal interest of wanting to grow myself as a human. And then it naturally expanded into all these different areas. So, I studied neuro linguistic programming, nutrition, Pilates. It's across a few different areas. But one thing that fundamentally ties everything together is how humans behave. So all of these outward things like movement or nutrition or
mm.
whatnot, it all comes back to the same thing. We all have patterns of behavior. We all do things in a certain way. What makes someone motivated to do something but not something else?
Mhm.
And that kind of is really interesting to me. So I guess it just came from a natural progression from what I had learnt from acting into my own natural interest in this space of human behavior. And
Mhm.
then the application actually, so the thing that ties it together is human behavior, but the application is different. So you study human behavior for the purposes of embodying a character and presenting it as entertainment, or you study human behavior and you apply it to help people better their lives. It's the
Yeah.
same thing in a way.
Amazing. And so I absolutely love that. I'm so fascinated about acting because I'm always like, yeah, I feel like I get the characters. And at the time of this recording, there's Baby Girl coming out with Nicole Kidman.
Oh, yes.
And that character looks very interesting, where she's like this CEO who's risking everything to have this affair with like a younger intern, but it's very like there's a dominant and a submissive, and I want to go watch it because it seems very interesting. And Nicole seems to be one of those people who really gets into the character. But I guess that second part is I do want to go back to, because I think a lot of people can relate to this when you know what's right for you, you know the direction you're going, but dealing with other people and dealing with people who maybe knew the old version of Rachel, who is an actress, and you're like, oh, well, this is my new path now, or dealing with other people's judgments, or people going, again, are you sure, sweetheart? Like, do you want to change careers, sort of thing? How did you deal with that part of the ego and managing that as well?
I think for me, around that transition, I don't think it came so much from other people's perception of it, to be honest. I feel like
Mm,
more what was happening was more my own judgment of
mm,
it. And, there's a certain, I mean, it can be seen in different ways, right? Acting, I think when you tell people you're an actress, especially, when you're younger, it's not something that everybody does. Not everybody sort of walks around and says, like, I'm an actor and that's what I do professionally. And so it does give you a certain element of significance, and you do feel like, oh, I'm a little bit different because not everybody is an actor, and like living in
mm,
LA, doing Hollywood and all that, that's not something that people do every day. But so for me, I think it was more about my perception of that importance of being an actor and that significance, as opposed to, being in the wellness space. You're not really, I mean, you can be a public figure, obviously, and you have a personal brand and whatnot, but it's a different thing. And
yeah.
so it wasn't so much that I felt like I got judgment from other people. I think I've always had supportive people around me to sort of encourage me to pursue whichever direction
Mm,
I wanted to go in. But I think for me, it was more my own internal thought about what that was. And like we chatted about in our podcast chat, the ego versus the path of least resistance. And it's like, are you going to uphold this idea and identity of who you've built for yourself, but then knowing that there's an element of you that's not in it anymore, and so it for me it was a bit of a slow transition out. It took quite a few years to actually not be I always had representation. I always haven't had a manager my whole sort of career. And I left my management when I actually left the industry. And so for me, that
mm.
was a big thing, is that to not have representation, or not to leave my management. That was the point where I was like, I'm actually just leaving that version of me behind. But that took
Mm.
quite a few years. Like I held on for a while, and I was
Yeah.
I was doing both for a while. I was, still acting, and I was still doing wellness at the same time. But it gets to a point where that you're holding on to it, but you're not really in it. And I think that's the same for not just career, but you can also translate to relationships. You can translate to a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different areas in your life where you're like, oh, but maybe, if I just do it for a little bit longer, like maybe something will happen or something will change. But deep down that you've already checked out of it. You just
Mm.
now it's more about you're comfortable doing it. You're just a bit, what's going to come now? I don't know what it's like to not be an actor. I don't know who Rachel is if she's not an actor, and so that's confronting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as someone who works with a lot of high performance women, this is so common, particularly in athletes, right? Where it's like, if I'm not a gold medal swimmer, like I've reached the peak of my industry, and I'm not saying a gold medal swimmer, I'm just saying, for example, but like if that's the pinnacle of your thing, or, someone's like, I've always wanted to be in a movie, I've made the movie, now what? Like, who am I now? What's the goalpost now? And really it is that. It's like, who am I outside of this whole culture, this whole thing? And it's huge. And like you're saying, it's not just career. It could be, similarly for myself, it's like when I let go of my marriage, it's like, who am I as a single person? The last time I was single, I was 22. So it's like, okay,
The
who
dating game's changed since then.
tell me about it. So, and then all the things that come with that. So I think it's so amazing that you touched on that. So you've gone through this incredible journey, which it sounds like it took a few years of finding your identity, shifting identity, doing all of these really big things. And I can imagine the emotional roller coaster that must have been as well. What things did you do to redesign your life so that you could go into wellness coaching and start a new industry and let go of this old identity? Was there anything that you were doing, or what kind of things?
Yeah, lots of things. Because, firstly, I mean, aside from personal development, which I was looking into anyway, a lot of the things that I started to do were just simply the foundational basics of having a good wellness routine. So, adopting good nutrition, exercising regularly, all those kinds of things, which I sort of did sporadically, before, but I really wanted that to be a normal part of my life. That was a base foundation, non-negotiable. And so I really adopted all of these things, became, quite fit and healthy. I remember I used to watch people run along the beach and think, oh, why would anybody, firstly, decide to run? It looks horrible and, gross. But also, like, I wish I could run like that because it looks so effortless for them to be able to do that. And so, to be able to ingrain myself with essentially it's a new identity, new habits, right, that become normal
Mm.
to me. And so it started with those things, the foundational wellness things of just doing those things. But then, it started with nutrition, exercise, movement, and then, all the mindset stuff, meditation, journaling, things that I do daily now that I don't have to think about it because I just do it. But also, I've always come from the perspective of, if you are to lead people, or if you giving advice to people, then my personal perspective on it is that I would like to lead by example. So I don't feel like I can be giving advice or giving tips to people if I'm not personally doing them myself. And so that's kind of where the base of it started. And then, yeah, almost it's just like recreating a whole new person. And I would say that starts from just me as a person rather than the career necessarily. So the coaching and all of that kind of stuff comes after you do it for yourself in a way. And so I think I had to more so become that person first.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And I think this kind of ties into James Clear, Atomic Habits as
Mm.
well, right? He sort of talks about if that same example of like running, for example, someone who identifies as I'm now a runner.
Mm.
It could be day one that they're starting to run, but they're like, you know what? I'm putting on running gear. I'm up early. I'm going for a run. That is the identity of a runner, and that's who I am versus someone who's like, oh, I'll never be a runner, but I'm just going to start running and I'm just going to try. Like it's a very different kind of shift, and I love that even the ritual of all these wellness things, like you're saying, like taking care of yourself, nutrition, no one can take that from you. Like,
Mm.
regardless of the job you have, the money you make, the relationship you're in, that's things that no one can take from you. And I think that's really where the strength comes, because I think a lot of the clients I work with, we look at their spirituality, and when I look at that, I'm not just talking about what are your beliefs or anything like that. I'm really talking about what are your rituals that make you you. And a lot of them are like, I don't really have any. I'm like, do you have a special place that's your place when you want to go ground yourself or connect, you go there? Oh, kind of, but and I was like, "Oh, when's the last time you've been there?" "Oh, probably about 6 months ago." And it's like we all need these parts of ourselves that aren't connected to the external, like we're talking about, that just make Rachel Rachel or Sheena Sheena, that no one can take from us, so that when shit does hit the fan, when we have, maybe someone passes away unexpectedly, I know I need to go work out and just go to my space and chill out. I have a spot on the beach that I just go sit near a tree. That's my spot. But that would be where I would go if someone I love passed away, or I needed to write a letter or something. And I think I love that you talk about I just needed to get those foundations and those basics sorted, because that's exactly where you should go. And I absolutely love that. And I hope anyone listening is thinking about that for themselves too. Like what makes you you outside of the career stuff, the relationship stuff, that if something happened, you could always come back to those foundational pieces. And so I guess that goes really nicely towards our final R, which is about realignment. So do you ever find yourself I mean, because we've spoken a lot about ego today, but when you catch yourself slipping into old patterns or falling into old habits, what do you do to kind of stay in this really grounded place? Or when you find that your foundations are slipping, maybe, how do you stay in a good and healthy place?
I think the first thing is awareness. And I know this is going to be, this is kind of one of the hardest things I think to pinpoint because you've got to be in the moment to realize that you are in a pattern. And, I feel like one of the things actually more recently that's come up in terms of patterns is when you hit limitations, and if you hit, oh, I don't know why that's happening.
Oh, for those who are watching this, like some little, it looks like almost like a Facebook, like
Little
down thumb.
emoji comes out. I didn't do a thumbs down, by the way, but
Yeah, yeah,
anyway.
yeah. We're on Zoom, so I don't know why that's happening. But anyway, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so when you come up against I feel like limitations, for example, there's a certain default and with anything, with any pattern you have, right? There's a default reaction that you go to. And it could be if you are anxious, you have a default response. If you hit a limitation, you have a default response. If something else happens, you have a default response. So I think the first thing is to be aware. I try to be aware of when I'm in a moment of let's take anxiety. I think that's one that everyone can sort of relate
Mm,
to. You get into an anxious moment and my first question for myself in that moment is what is the story that I'm telling myself? What's the thought that's
mm,
going through my mind at the moment? Because generally speaking, yes, anxiety is a physiological feeling in the body. You might sort of have that, clammy hands or that heart palpitations or however you experience it in your body is a signal that you're feeling anxious. So my first question is what is it that I'm telling myself? Usually it's some sort of fear thought or I'm catastrophizing or something or thinking the worst case scenario. And then I'll usually try and flip it to say, but what if it all works out?
mm.
And we very rarely default to that. We
Yeah.
always tend to default to the worst case scenario. So, what if it all works out? What if that's not true? What if that worst case scenario that you're telling yourself isn't actually true? What if you had generous assumptions about whatever this thing is? And that would immediately sort of dissipate the physiological feeling. But you obviously got to keep repeating that. So I think and I'm just using that as an example because our patterns, we have so many different patterns in different things. So I think it's just being aware of when we hit a pattern that's not helpful for us, and then to ask the question and just interrupt the pattern is probably the best way that I use to do it. I can't always catch my patterns, but that's what I try to do when I come up against a point where, maybe I'm not feeling so great and I don't feel like working out, and I tend to work out, 5, 6 times a week. But if I don't feel like it, and I don't always feel like it, I generally will try and make myself just do 5 minutes, the bare minimum. And then once you do 5 minutes, you're in a different physiological state, and then you more than likely will keep going. So it's just that little moment of catching yourself and then taking a more positive action instead of defaulting into whatever your normal reactionary thing is. That's what I try to do. Yeah.
Oh, amazing, Rachel. I think that that's wonderful advice and so wise. And I wrote down, and I think I'll put this in the show notes so we can all remember. But when you're having those moments where things aren't always going to be in alignment, even when you've gone through something and you're on the other side. But what's the story am I telling myself? I think
Mm.
that's so powerful because I think if I think about the last time I might have been anxious, if I ask myself, what was the story I was telling myself? I think for a lot of us, it comes back to my I'm not good enough story. And we all have one or several, we all have them. Every single person on the planet has them. And again, awareness is key of like, I know what my not good enough story is, and it's probably activated right now. And I think it's great if you can get yourself back to that space, but also having those safe people, right? Like there are certain for just just being out there like in certain situations I'll call my mum because I know she'll make me feel better, and then there's certain situations where she might not be the person who's going to make me feel better. And I
Mm.
think it's knowing what situations can I make myself feel better, and then who are those people that I can go, oh my God, this just happened in my business, or this just happened on social media, or I just had a troll call me out on whatever, right? And knowing what can I do for myself, which is a great thing. What story am I telling myself right now? I think that's wonderful. And then, yeah, having those people who can regulate you, because not everyone's going to have a great response if you go to someone and they're like, of course you got trolled. Why would you even put yourself on social media? Like, you don't want someone who's going to react like that. It just makes the situation worse. So, Rachel, I have loved this chat. It's always so deep when we get together. I love it. So, for people who want to learn more about you, your story, hear more about all the things you talk about, where can they find you?
I think the best place to go is the podcast, which is called the Rachel J Podcast, and you can find it on Apple or Spotify. My website is racheljay.co, and you can find me on Instagram as well. So at RachJ, it's double underscore. And I kind of hang out mostly there. I am on TikTok, but I feel like TikTok's just another world. So I'm applauding you for getting on there.
Yes, well, and I'll have all the links to Rachel's stuff in the show notes, of course. So thanks so much, Rachel. And of course, reach out to Rachel and I. You know, the podcasting world is very interesting. We don't always get to hear the feedback. We know you're out there. We just don't always hear it. So if you love this episode, you learned something, you have some feedback, please reach out to either Rachel or myself. We would love to hear from you. And we will see you in the next episode of Burnout to Brilliance.